So today we're going to talk about the novel 100 Years of Solitude by the Colombian writer Gabriel García Márquez. 100 Years of Solitude was first published in 1967 in Spanish and has since then been translated into many languages and become a landmark. Gabriel García Márquez was born in 1927 and died in 2014. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. 100 Years of Solitude. Okay, so it spans several generations of one family, the Buendías, and in this video I want to talk to you about the importance of this book and why I think everyone should read it. I think 100 Years of Solitude has universal appeal, and I think that's rare for a novel. Its author, García Márquez, is a great storyteller. That's the main thing you need to know. So I think even the most sophisticated reader cannot resist a well-told story. And 100 Years of Solitude is that, a well-told story. The craft behind the novel is solid. All the ingredients that make a good story are in this book. Emotion, action, empathy, even a bit of magic. And talking about magic, let's talk about what many people think about when they think about 100 Years of Solitude. Magical realism. This is a term, I think, that I hear a lot of people misuse. Not necessarily when they talk about 100 Years of Solitude, but when they talk about later books by other authors, particularly American authors. I think that some people tend to focus a lot on the word magical and not enough on the word realism. Now, there is a long tradition in Latin America that precedes Gabriel García Márquez, whereby magical elements are introduced in otherwise realist tales. But I do think that magical realism spread to other world literatures, other countries, because of the phenomenal success of 100 Years of Solitude in the 1960s and later in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even now. So García Márquez belongs to what some critics refer to as the Latin American boom. Other people see this term as a marketing tool, but the fact remains that García Márquez did lead a group of then young writers in the 60s and 70s, young writers from different Latin American countries, and that movement, that Latin American boom, put Latin America on the map of world literature, as it were. Of course, don't shout, I can hear you loud. There have been important Latin American writers in previous generations. It's impossible not to think of Borges here, and Borges belongs to the generation before those then young and hungry writers that came out in the 1960s and became popular and celebrated not just across the region, but more importantly, I think, in Europe and in North America. And the main writer of that group is Gabriel García Márquez. Now, I get the feeling that now some readers see the use of magical elements in realist narrative as a cheap trick or a cop-out, and they are probably right. I think that's what it is when it is used by lesser writers, but I don't think that's the case with 100 Years of Solitude. So if you've never read this novel and somehow feel put off by the very mention of the term magical realism, I would say, yeah, I understand that, but I would also ask you to put your prejudices aside and still pick up this novel, okay? Because it's not what you're thinking it is, probably. Now, let's talk about it. We have the town of Macondo, which is a fictional town where the Buendías live. Many readers think that Macondo is in Colombia, but it could really be any town in Latin America. Possibly it could be anywhere in the world. Now, let's look at magical realism in this novel and what it means here. And let's begin by looking at realism, okay? So in 100 Years of Solitude, García Márquez tells us about a poor, backward, isolated society, and he does not spare us any details, right? He's very evocative when portraying how poor the inhabitants of Macondo are. García Márquez zooms in on one particular family, starting from the beginning of that family with Aureliano Buendía and Ursula Iguarán. Now, the Buendía family could be any Latin American family. They could be any family, in fact. In fact, they do remind me a lot of my own family and my ancestors in many ways, you know, things that I know about my ancestors. But okay, how Garcia Marquez talks here about his characters is realistic, okay? So don't forget that. Otherwise, I think millions of other readers wouldn't recognize our families in the Buendias. And while there are magical elements in the story, they are never jarring to me. They never take me out of the story, and I don't think they'll take you out of the story. In fact, I think those magical elements do the opposite. They make everything seem more real, right? As a reader, I never felt like Garcia Marquez was trying to fool me. The magical elements, which are few and far between anyway, I think only add beauty to the narrative. They definitely don't feel like a cheap trick or a cop-out, just to use those terms again. The context of this novel is a war that never seems to end, and that is also sadly many people's experience. Likely not mine, and I hope not yours either. But if you think about places like Colombia, even now, or Syria, or so many places around the world where there are ongoing wars that last years, sometimes even decades. You know, sometimes those wars are not even defined as such, and then I have to think about countries that are incredibly violent, like even parts of the United States right now, or Mexico, or many other places, you know? So I think what Garcia Marquez does so masterfully in 100 Years of Solitude is to test the limits of reality in that extreme situation, right? Of extreme poverty and war. He tells a multi-generational story here of the Buendia family. So, well, and he does it so well that readers empathize with the characters, but they also see themselves and their own families or people they know in this novel. And I think that could happen regardless of your own background, regardless of the reader's background. That's why I say that this novel has universal appeal, and I stand by it. And all this works because of the craft, right? I think that what I admire the most about Garcia Marquez is his craft as a writer. Now, whether in his longer novels such as 100 Years of Solitude or Love in Times of Cholera, which I have somewhere behind me on my shelf, or even in his shorter fiction, I am always in awe of how masterfully constructed the narrative is. Now, Garcia Marquez, as I say, is a great storyteller. He knows how to get the reader, how to capture your attention and keep it until the very end. His books, and this one is no exception, are not the kind of books that reader quit or bail on. Once you begin to read any of his books, it is almost impossible to stop. They are incredibly compelling. They pull you in, and almost on every page there is something new, some exciting new promise, some secret, some narrative element that compels you to read on, and 100 Years of Solitude is the best example of that. And one of the things I think also you need to understand about magical realism in this novel in particular, and why it fits so perfectly in that, is that Garcia Marquez draws from rural Latin American legends and myths. Now, I don't think Latin America is specifically unique in this, in having those myths. I think every society has its own legends and myths. But what seems magical or fantastical, and I think that's a better word, in 100 Years of Solitude, it's something that belongs to the character's worldview, right? So here where I live in the Canary Islands, we have tons of legends and superstitions. And a lot of them are quite similar to the stuff in this novel. And I think that's why perhaps those magical or fantastical elements in 100 Years of Solitude are not jarring to me or to other readers. I don't even, to be honest, I don't even see them as magical. I see them as belonging to a less modern, more superstitious society like Macondo. And I think that is the context you need to read them in. And trust me, they'll make sense in that context. But Garcia Marquez is not a one-trick pony, right? There's variety, huge variety within his fiction. To me, the novels that have the most in common are 100 Years of Solitude and Love in Times of Cholera, which I also love and recommend. But if you want to see what else he's capable of, then I think I would suggest you pick up some of his other novels. He even has historical novels, and also his short fiction. I love his short fiction. Also, Garcia Marquez was a journalist, so you might want to read some of his non-fiction as well. I haven't read any of it, but I think I will at some point soon. Anyway, be that as it may, you will find a list of all the books available in English translation in the description box for this video, so you can go and take your time and see what appeals to you. In case you're interested, you might not be interested, but in case you're interested, I've compiled the list of all the books available in English. So going back now to 100 Years of Solitude, this novel is just as addictive as the best Latin American telenovela. I don't know if you've ever watched telenovelas, but they're very addictive. Or to make it a bit more universal, the best K-drama. I know a lot of people watch Korean TV dramas, so that's kind of what you get here. Now, this novel is also multi-layered, so you can read it many times over. I've read it many times, I don't know how many times. And I always get something new out of it, or discover something about the characters or the story that I had missed before. And I think what touches people when they read 100 Years of Solitude may be different from what touches other people. So what touches me may be different to what touches you. And also what touches me when I read it now might be different to what happens when I read it again in 5 years' time. And that richness is also one of the reasons I recommend 100 Years of Solitude to everyone. Now, reading this novel is also an emotional journey, and as much as I admire its craft, I just can't help but to be moved by 100 Years of Solitude every time I read it, at least passages, right? 100 Years of Solitude is a novel that makes me laugh, makes me cry, or if not quite cry, it moves me, right? And I am sure that you know what I'm talking about if you've read it. So I also, I also do think that the more you read 100 Years of Solitude, the more you will like it. It is that kind of book so if you read it once and thought, it's okay, it was good, but it was okay, read it again, you'll probably love it. Okay, now having said that, I'm probably setting myself up here for getting comments from people who hate this book. And actually that would be great. I'm not being funny here. That would be great because I've never met anyone who hated 100 Years of Solitude. So I would genuinely look forward to hearing from people who hate it and hearing why they hate it. Because, as a matter of fact, I know or I suspect that there are people out there, there must be people out there, who don't think much of 100 Years of Solitude. And I would generally love to hear from them here in this video in the comment section. So let me know, okay? But going back to the book, I'm not done here. It sounded like I was gonna round off this video. I'm not done yet. I wanted to talk about the best character in the novel. Maybe not the best character, but the one that actually holds the novel together. And I think that's Ursula. She's the only character whose life actually spans the 100 years of narrative time. So this book, it takes place in over 100 years, and she's the only character that's there from the very beginning until the very end, right? So who is Ursula? Ursula is the matriarch of the family, and she's a larger-than-life character. Ursula actually reminds me of some women in my own family, a particular ancestor that I keep hearing about. And actually, strong women, this novel, strong women are important in this novel, and strong women are an important part, an important element in my own family narrative, and I think everyone has a family narrative. Anyway, I think that but my own family, it's irrelevant here. The important thing you need to know about that is that Garcia Marquez apparently grew up surrounded by women, right? So strong women were part of his life and his childhood. And I think that's something that transpires in this novel and also some of his other works. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind when you read 100 Years of Solitude. Okay, but let's talk a little bit more about this family, the Buendias, without any spoilers, of course. So there are a total of 7 different generations of the Buendia family that we learn about as we read on. Of course, also there are other major characters that do not belong to the family, but everyone in this book, it's linked to the family one way or another. Everyone lives in Macondo or visits Macondo, right? So everyone has close links to the Buendia family. And talking about the Buendia family, something that I know that some readers, I would say most readers, including me, right, find confusing, particularly when they first read 100 Years of Solitude, is the names of the characters. Not because they're in Spanish, I think the names are quite easy to learn, but this is a multi-generational story. And what happens is that a lot of the names of the family members are repeated. So you have characters from different generations, different characters from different generations, from those 7 generations that share the same name. And that can be confusing because sometimes you might not know who the novel is referring to. And also, I suspect, I don't find it strange, and I will tell you why in a second, but I suspect that some people find that repetition of names strange. So let me tell you something about that. This is just part of tradition. In case you don't know, it is common in Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries for people to pay homage to their ancestors by naming their children after them. So they can name children after themselves. So parents may name children after themselves, but also sometimes after ancestors, right? So it is common for a child in Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries in Europe and in Latin America. It is common, less and less common now, but it is still fairly common, and it was a lot more common in the past for a child to bear his grandfather's name. But sometimes not just that, but also like his uncle's name or even his father's name, right? So for instance, going back to my own family history, my middle name was my grandfather's first name, and my brother's middle name was my grandfather's middle name. So both my brother and I are named after our grandfather, right? And I have a cousin who's also named after my grandfather, okay? So there you go. Now, my mom was named after her grandmother, and so on. The names, I could go on into every generation of my family. The names repeat themselves all the time. So when I read 100 Years of Solitude, and when I first read it, I never thought that the fact that the names are repeated within the different generations was strange at all. For me, it's completely normal, and it's what I'm used to anyway. But having said that, because the book has been translated into English and is so popular everywhere in the world, I can imagine how readers from other cultures would find this weird. So I thought I'd explain it in this video. Now, of course, the fact that this is a traditional practice, naming children after ancestors, that doesn't make the practice in this book any less confusing, right? So luckily, many editions come with the family tree. So for instance, this Spanish language edition that I have has this family tree. I hope you can see it. So you can check up who everyone is supposed to be and how they are all related. So if you're going to buy a copy of this book, make sure that your edition has a family tree. But if it doesn't, don't worry, you can always Google it. I think it's even on Wikipedia. So if you're confused, just stop, Google, and you'll be able to work it out. It's really not that confusing, right? But, I would say that if you've never read this novel before, you need to brace yourself, because there are a lot of characters in this family and outside the family, and many of the characters within the family share the same name. Okay, so that can be confusing, but it's not all that confusing, and it can be a little bit of fun as well, I think. Now, let's talk a little bit about the themes in this novel, and one of the main themes of 100 Years of Solitude is incest. Okay, but don't worry, it's not a heavy issue here. The originators of the Buendía family, or of this dynasty, the generations, so the founders are José Arcadio Buendía and Úrsula Iguarán. I've already spoken about Úrsula as the character who is the glue to the narrative and the family. But the problem is that they are cousins. José and Úrsula are cousins, first cousins. So after they get married, Úrsula is afraid of getting pregnant because according to superstition, something that she's heard, I think, in her own family, children who are born out of incest are born with pigtails, right? So they are born with a little pigtail in their lower backs, right? So Úrsula is afraid that if she has children with her husband and cousin, those children would be born with a little pigtail. That doesn't happen, okay? That's the only spoiler I'm gonna give you in this video. That doesn't happen. The children are fine. Okay, so let's go more into the narrative. So one day they're married, and one day José Arcadio dreams of a town full of mirrors, and he also dreams of a name, of a strange name, Macondo. So what does he do? He takes his wife and first cousin. I'm going to stop saying that because it's weird. It's weirding me out to say it. He takes his wife, Ursula, and a bunch of other people that they know, and they all go in search of a suitable place where they can establish a new town. And they're going to name that town Macondo. And Macondo is where all the later generations are all going to live, and it's the setting of this novel. The problem is that the place they choose for Macondo could not be more isolated or more remote. And that leads us to another one of the major themes in this novel, which is perhaps the most obvious theme because it's in the title. And I think it's the most important theme as well. And that theme is solitude, or in Spanish, as you can see here properly, soledad. Okay, solitude. Now, talking a little bit about that, let's talk a little bit more about some of the other characters. There is one character here, one of the main characters in the novel who doesn't belong to the family, to the Buendía family, but is incredibly important, is Melquiades. Who is Melquiades? Melquiades is one of the gypsies that come to Macondo, I think, once a year. He arrives in Macondo once a year with a bunch of other gypsies. And why? He goes there to bring along inventions from the outside world, because Macondo is completely isolated from not just the rest of Colombia. We actually don't know that it's Colombia, but we tend to assume it is, but from the rest of the world. So Melquiades actually is I think practically the only link between that isolated town that is Macondo and the rest of the world. So the fact of the matter is that Macondo is so remote that all the inventions that Melquiades and the gypsies bring along with them seem magical to the inhabitants of Macondo, particularly because you have those later generations of people who have never gone away, so they don't know the world. All they know is Macondo. Macondo is their world, right? So even something as simple as ice seems magical to them. Why? Okay, you need to realize that Macondo is isolated, right? But it's also a hot, although quite wet, but hot, wet, remote area somewhere in Latin America, right? So ice doesn't happen naturally there. And also I don't think there's electricity, so they've never seen ice. So when the gypsies bring ice, it seems like magic to them, okay? So that goes back to that magical realism thing that you need to bear in mind. What seems magical to them, it's not necessarily magical, it's just their worldview, right? Gabriel García Márquez, let's talk about influences. He was influenced by the work of the Mexican writer, of the Southern American writer William Faulkner, and I've spoken about those two writers in recent videos, which I'm going to link to in the description box. So I think in 100 Years of Solitude you're going to find echoes of Rulfo and Faulkner. I would say that Garcia Marquez's writing is a lot more accessible than that of Rulfo and Faulkner particularly, okay? And I think because he's more accessible, I think that explains in part the phenomenal and ongoing commercial success of 100 Years of Solitude around the world, okay? So he's a lot more accessible than Rulfo and Faulkner. I think Rulfo is a little bit more accessible than Faulkner. So it's a Faulkner, Rulfo, Garcia Marquez, okay? Don't worry, you don't need to read those authors to read this, but I think if you do, you'll get a lot more out of this, and you'll see particularly the influence of Rulfo's Pedro Páramo in 100 Years of Solitude, and you can see that in how Garcia Marquez talks about the past in this novel. This novel is very nostalgic, and Pedro Páramo is also very nostalgic, has a very nostalgic tone. So I think he got the nostalgic tone for this novel from Pedro Páramo. And from Faulkner, what's the influence from Faulkner? I think Garcia Marquez was influenced by The Sound and the Fury. Why? Because The Sound and the Fury, if you've watched my review of Read the Book, you'd know that The Sound and the Fury has to do with the decadence of a family. And that's also a theme here. Although in the case of The Sound and the Fury, the family, the Compsons, are already in decadence throughout the novel, okay? So from the moment you start reading, the family is already in decadence. And 100 Years of Solitude gives you a wider picture because you get the rise and fall of the Buendia family in this case, not just the fall, but also the rise, right? Another thing that I think Garcia Marquez steals, with quotation marks, okay, because he's no plagiarist, but I think another thing that he was inspired by Faulkner is in the creation of a fictional place to set his stories at. Like Macondo is not just present in 100 Years of Solitude, it's also present in some of his other fiction. So in the case of Faulkner, Faulkner created the Yokna-Patofa County in Mississippi, which is a fictional county. And then Garcia Marquez created Macondo, which may or may not be in Colombia. It's a little bit more abstract, but it is in Colombia. We know that, even though it's not explicitly said that's but it is there, right? And I think Garcia Marquez took something from both Rulfo and Faulkner, something that both Rulfo and Faulkner has in common, and that's the non-linear structure. But again, I think Garcia Marquez makes it more palatable, more accessible to the reader, to the general reader, than Faulkner, for instance, does in The Sound and the Fury, but I think there is also a difference. I think something that distinguishes 100 Years of Solitude from The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, and also distinguishes 100 Years of Solitude from even Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo, is its humor, right? This book, you will laugh, okay? And 100 Years of Solitude is nostalgic, can be a little bit sad, but it is also a funny book, right? It's a novel that makes you laugh, and it makes me laugh, and that's rare. It's rare for me to laugh when reading a book, And, if you compare that with Juan Rulfo or Faulkner, I think that's quite a big difference, because I don't think anyone has ever laughed reading The Sound and the Fury, and I would be really worried if someone read The Sound and the Fury and laughed. But you will laugh if you reading 100 Years of Solitude. There are also other literary references in this novel, aside from Faulkner and Juan Rulfo, mainly the Bible, specifically the book of the Genesis. Another thing that the Bible and 100 Years of Solitude have in common is that they're both best-selling books. But the irony is that when Garcia Marquez wrote 100 Years of Solitude, he did not think it would sell well at all, and it has become one of the best-selling books of all time globally. He was already an established writer when this book first came out in the 1960s, but I think without a doubt 100 Years of Solitude is what made him a household name. And even today, I think Gabriel García Márquez is one of those very few writers that I think most people have heard about, even if they haven't read any of his books. So let me know if you've read 100 Years of Solitude. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. My name is Juan. I hope you're all doing very well and staying safe. This is all from me for now. I hope to see you again very soon for another book review. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.